I had made the same mistake so many times. You know, searching for something in a package that I thought I would want. And when
Another day, more tomfoolery, or should I say puffery. Hello, my friends, it's Perez, the queen of all media, the original influencer, and still your #1 source for everything in the It Ends With Us saga. This judge has allowed his courtroom to turn into a circus, and I would know I've been part of one before. Just minutes ago, the soon-to-be redacted hopefully Blake Lively, not literally. Sorry, I just had a Steve Sorowitz moment. Let's try that again. Just minutes ago, the soon-to-be redacted actress filed a memorandum of law in further support of a motion for spoliation sanctions, and, not coincidentally, around the same time, the Wicked Witch herself, Stephanie Jones, Justin Baldoni's fired publicist, filed her own memorandum of law in further support of spoliation sanctions. If this judge were properly managing his courtroom and docket, this should have been shut down already. But here we are. Both the redaction queen and Stephanie Jones already filed fully briefed motions for spoliation sanctions with the court. And yet, surprise, we've got more to add. So why don't we take a listen to what the subpoena superstar has to say? You know who took the lead on this ethically challenged performance? Ezra. She jumps right in. No foreplay, straight to the point. In their opposition to the motion for spoliation sanctions, defendants admit they took no steps to preserve ephemeral communications prior to December 20th, 2024. Pause, because they weren't required to. They weren't put on notice until December. That sounds like bad lawyering. Ezra continues, claiming that defendants admit they took no steps to preserve these communications and that they've now been irretrievably destroyed. Okay, pause again. Blake's very mid-level lawyer is clearly talking about those Signal chats. And yes, some may be gone, but I distinctly remember seeing plenty of Signal messages. Weren't some of them from August 2024? Or am I misremembering? Ezra goes on to argue that ephemeral communications allowed defendants to speak quickly, candidly, and most importantly covertly. She cites Melissa Nathan, who acknowledged that when documents are sent, certain work cannot be shared because it could cause serious trouble. Ezra claims none of the defendants' excuses for failing to preserve communications hold up. First, she says their argument that they anticipated litigation only regarding harassment, but not retaliation, is entirely disingenuous and plainly wrong, both factually and legally. She points to the November 9, 2023 protections document, where Lively explicitly warned against retaliation in all its forms, changes in attitude, sarcasm, marginalization, or other negative behavior, whether on set, during publicity, or elsewhere, and warned that such conduct would be met with immediate action. Action was bolded and italicized. Instead of heeding that warning, Ezra claims the defendants treated it like a roadmap and immediately engaged in retaliation exactly as described. And listen, I know Ezra and everyone in her office watches my videos. This is tomfoolery. This is puffery. This is showmanship. It's just as much for the media as it is for the spectators who are obsessively following this saga. And honestly, this is for me. Because this entire case, at its core, is about the very thing we've been talking about non-stop for days now. Ezra, I see you. She continues by arguing that the protections document gave defendants just as much notice of potential litigation for retaliation as it did for harassment. I love when they tell on themselves. The fact that it's almost 2026 and we're still here is because of retaliation, not because of any alleged non-existent misconduct that was supposedly so horrific that an Oscar-nominated actress and her husband labeled someone a predator. Remember that. Second, Ezra argues that in a cynical attempt to benefit from their own misconduct, defendants claim Lively failed to demonstrate the contents of the destroyed communications, but Rule 37E doesn't require that, and it couldn't because that would allow bad actors to escape accountability by destroying evidence and then hiding behind that destruction. Obviously, the contents can't be shown because they were destroyed. That's the entire point. Third, defendants argue Lively hasn't suffered prejudice because there is already substantial evidence of retaliatory conduct, making the missing communications unnecessary and cumulative. In other words, they claim the proof already exists through other means, but they don't stop there. They continue by insisting that defendants ignored their own repeated, emphatic, and very public proclamations that they did nothing to advance any digital campaign and were merely monitoring online conversations. The issue with that claim is obvious if left unchecked. Defendants are free to redefine what monitoring means after the fact, tailoring the definition to suit their litigation strategy. By destroying the underlying communications, they effectively insulated themselves from impeachment, eliminating the very documentary evidence that could contradict their story. This creates a one-sided evidentiary vacuum where defendants control the narrative, without fear of being confronted by their own words. That is not a minor procedural issue, it is textbook prejudice. When relevant records are destroyed, the opposing party is deprived of the ability to challenge credibility, probe intent, or demonstrate coordination. And the integrity of the fact-finding process itself is compromised. At that point, the damage cannot be undone through argument alone. It can only be mitigated, if at all, through limiting instructions or serious remedial measures imposed by the court. Finally, defendants' argument that they lacked the requisite intent is flatly contradicted by their own admissions. They have acknowledged clearly and repeatedly that they anticipated litigation no later than August 2024. Yet despite that awareness, they took no meaningful steps whatsoever to preserve the communications that are now conveniently gone. Let's pause here, because this is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable for some. This isn't about taking sides. It's about following the facts. By August 2024, defendants were already engaging with lawyers. The Wayfarer parties understood that litigation was not hypothetical, it was looming. They've said this themselves. Under those circumstances, it would have been not only prudent, but expected that legal counsel would advise them to begin preserving documents immediately. Even if that advice wasn't formally given, the obligation doesn't disappear. It is true they did not officially retain Brian Friedman until December 2024, but that timing does not excuse months of inaction. Their own filings concede that litigation was anticipated no later than August 2024, and yet they still failed to preserve communications they now admit were isolated. In fact, defendants confirmed that signal chats could have been preserved at any point with a flick of a switch. The choice not to do so was not accidental or unavoidably was a conscious decision, and that deliberate decision, coupled with the migration to ephemeral messaging platforms, strongly suggests an intent to avoid creating a discoverable record. Precisely the type of conduct that courts have found warrants severe sanctions. It was not a mere request that defendants Baldoni, Heath, and Wayfarer issue a public statement apologizing for their onset misconduct that was followed by a vicious, highly coordinated, and viral online hate campaign aimed not only at Miss Lively, but also at other female cast members. That campaign was all the more confounding given the film's remarkable box office success, which should have eliminated any supposed need for reputational damage control. The undisputed record establishes that each defendant used Signal and that ephemeral communications undeniably once existed. Faced with this reality, defendants now attempt to shift the blame onto Miss Lively, arguing that she failed to prove the contents of the Signal chats allegedly deleted, specifically those evidencing execution of the public relations crisis management strategy. But that argument completely inverts Rule 37's standard. Miss Lively is not required to reconstruct the very communications defendants destroyed. She need only establish that they existed. And here, the evidence of spoliation is overwhelming. Each defendant admitted in sworn interrogatory responses that they used Signal to discuss, among other things, the digital campaign, Miss Lively, Mr. Reynolds, and the film itself. The Wallace parties likewise admitted the existence of these communications and further acknowledged that, due to Signal's auto-delete settings, any potentially responsive messages were erased as a matter of course. This court has already found it undisputed that the Wayfarer parties used Signal to discuss issues directly relevant to this litigation, and discovery has only strengthened that conclusion. Party Productions revealed documents confirming the creation and use of Signal threads to discuss matters related to the retaliatory campaign as early as August 7, 2024. Moreover, at their respective depositions, defendants Heath, Nathan, and Abel each testified that they used Signal during the relevant period. As for Baldoni, he testified that he used Signal only to communicate with a support group prior to December 2024. But the record tells a different story. Evidence shows that he sent texts to that same support group directly addressing the harassment allegations. In November 2023 and January 2024, at a minimum, it defies logic to suggest that, during the height of this dispute in the fall of 2024, Baldoni was actively using Signal to communicate with a support group and somehow never once discussed Miss Lively. If he had, those communications would have been responsive and discoverable. The notion that such discussions never occurred strains credibility. Ezra continues by explaining that these facts that all defendants except Baldoni admitted to using Signal during the relevant time render the entire catalog of cases cited by defendants in opposition meaningless. Those cases turned on a plaintiff's failure to demonstrate that allegedly spoliated documents ever existed in the first place. Here, by contrast, the existence of the communications is established ex ante before the destruction, and cannot be seriously disputed. As a result of all this, defendants' spoliation has plainly prejudiced Miss Lively. The evidence shows that defendants, along with the Wallace parties, turned to Signal no later than mid-August 2024, precisely when the digital campaign was underway. The limited documents that were preserved and produced by the Wallace parties only underscore the prejudice. They revealed the parties' capacity to manipulate social media engagement, influence website traffic, and conceal their involvement in those efforts with relative ease. The fact that the most critical ephemeral communications, including those involving the Wallace parties, were not preserved deprives Miss Lively of the ability to test, contextualize, and rebut the counter-narratives defendants continue to advance. Notably in their opposition, defendants do not meaningfully address the concrete examples of prejudice identified by Miss Lively. Instead, they rely on the existence of other evidence cited in the opening brief, arguing that this somehow negates prejudice. but that argument improperly shifts the burden. It is well settled that a plaintiff need not prove prejudice when evidence has been destroyed. Rather, prejudice is inherent where a party's ability to rebut a defense has been compromised. That is exactly what happened here. Particularly with respect to defendants' repeated claim that they were merely monitoring online activity, courts including this court have recognized that the loss of communications bearing on such assertions establishes prejudice as a matter of law. Ms. Lively has been deprived of the digital trail necessary to test, challenge, and contextualize defendants' insistence that they did nothing beyond passive monitoring. Finally, defendants attempt to rely on Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, arguing that the lost communications would have been needlessly cumulative, but the destruction of even cumulative evidence itself supports a finding of prejudice, and Rule 403 has no application whatsoever to the analysis required under Rule 37E. Once again, defendants miss the point. Ezra goes on to argue that the Wayfarer parties are responsible for the Wallace party spoliation. Their attempt to distance themselves fails under well-established precedent in this circuit, which holds that a party may be liable for spoliation caused by a non-party under its control. Here, common sense and the record confirm that the Wallace party's ephemeral communications were within Wayfarer's control. Wayfarer hired the Wallace parties to support its crisis PR effort, paid them for that work, shared legal counsel with them, and knew no later than August 11, 2024 that the Wallace parties were using Signal. Under these circumstances, Wayfarer cannot disclaim responsibility. Ultimately, the evidence demonstrates that defendants intended to deprive Ms. Lively of discoverable evidence, rather than engaging with the substantial proof, showing intentional use of ephemeral communications as part of an untraceable strategy. Defendants point only two steps taken after December 20, 2024, to preserve Signal messages. Those after-the-fact measures do not erase months of deliberate nor do they negate culpable intent. Defendants admit that at all times they were fully capable of preserving these communications, yet they only began taking the appropriate preservation steps once the lawsuit was actually filed. This does not absolve them of wrongdoing. If anything, it is further evidence of their conscious dereliction of a well-known duty to preserve electronic data. The unrebutted record makes this clear. Defendants acted with the requisite intent for purposes of Rule 37E2 sanctions. Ephemeral communications existed and were highly relevant to the dispute. Yet, despite anticipating litigation, defendants took no steps to preserve these communications, and there is no credible explanation for their loss other than bad faith. The timing of their use of Signal leaves no room for doubt. By mid-August 2024, defendants knew litigation was reasonably foreseeable, and they deliberately chose to communicate through ephemeral channels precisely to avoid creating a permanent, discoverable record. In fact, they openly acknowledged the need to cover their tracks, understanding that documenting their actual work could get them into serious trouble. This is a textbook example of bad faith. If defendants were genuinely engaged in routine PR work, there would have been no reason to worry that their activities, if exposed, could cause problems. Yet the opposite is true. Their own documents confirm that an integral part of the crisis management strategy was that it be executed without leaving any trace, without fingerprints, as it were. By deliberately using ephemeral communications, they sought to insulate themselves from accountability while conducting a retaliatory digital campaign, ensuring their activities could not be used against them in legal proceedings. This is precisely the type of intentional misconduct that Rule 37E2 is designed to address. For these reasons, Ms. Lively's motion for spoliation sanctions should be granted. The record further demonstrates that defendants have repeatedly attempted to obscure the facts. Exhibits filed under seal, including a declaration by Ezra Hudson in further support of Ms. Lively's motion, reveal the extensive scope of In particular, Abel's conduct illustrates the point vividly. Abel's counsel attempts to argue that her duty to preserve extended only to certain allegations and did not include the PR campaign created to counter those allegations. But this artificial distinction collapses under even minimal scrutiny. The PR campaign was created for one reason alone: to influence the narrative surrounding the conduct that Abel herself knew could generate litigation. Communications about that campaign, including whether Abel's employer, JonesWorks, was aware or involved, were clearly relevant to anticipated litigation. Yet Abel failed entirely to preserve those records, effectively destroying critical evidence. Abel produced not a single Signal message prior to December 2024. Despite testifying that she used Signal in August 2024, the reason is obvious. She and her collaborators enabled Signal's auto-delete feature to ensure that these communications would vanish. Abel's attempt to dismiss the missing messages as cumulative entirely misses the point. The existing evidence shows that Jones and JonesWorks were excluded from certain aspects of the campaign, whereas the Signal messages would have demonstrated Abel's deliberate concealment, unilateral decision-making, and alignment with the client's interests against her employer. That evidence goes directly to the heart of her indemnification claim, which asserts she acted within the scope of her employment. Abel's deliberate destruction of communications prior to December 2024 coupled with her inability to explain their disappearance, reflects clear bad faith. A precise conduct Rule 37E2 sanctions are meant to address. Abel also argues that she was not required to preserve messages regarding the PR campaign because she only anticipated litigation regarding prior allegations in 2023. This argument is both legally and factually incorrect. Abel admitted that the PR campaign existed solely to address the allegations she anticipated would spur litigation. The distinction she now draws that communications about the campaign were somehow unrelated is artificial and unavailing. By August 2024, Abel was actively using Signal to coordinate PR strategy at a time when litigation was undeniably foreseeable. Her duty to preserve attached at that point, and any subsequent destruction of messages falls squarely within Rule 37E to a scope. Finally, Abel's destroyed Signal messages are critical to evaluating her indemnification claim. She argues that she acted under the employment and direction of Jones Works and that Jones Works should indemnify her, but the destroyed communications would show otherwise, that Abel acted independently, deliberately concealed her actions, and coordinated with Nathan and the Wallace parties without Jones Works' knowledge or approval. These communications would demonstrate Abel's decision-making, her intent to operate outside her authority, and her efforts to shield herself from accountability. In short, they would show that Abel acted alone, orchestrating the campaign and the retaliatory efforts, undermining her claim that Jones Works directed or authorized her conduct. The deliberate destruction of these messages is a textbook example of bad faith, and their absence severely prejudices Miss Lively's ability to challenge defendants' claims. I remember in the depositions Jamie Heath, and possibly Jennifer Abel as well, saying that after the whole brouhaha where Stephanie Jones allegedly contacted a reporter despite being instructed not to, Wayfarer told her to stand down and excluded her from further involvement. Stephanie of course argues that the now spoliated non-existent Signal communications would show some personal benefit to her actions. She claims the messages might reveal Abel's supposed conspiracy to leave Jones Works, but that part is misleading. There was no conspiracy. What the messages would have shown, instead, is how Abel continued working with Wayfarer and Nathan, acting for herself rather than for Jones Works. This evidence goes straight to the heart of the central question, whether Abel was operating within the scope of her employment. Abel's choice to use Signal to operate independently of Jones Works, effectively hiding her activities from her employer, is incredibly significant. The existing emails and text messages produced in this litigation already show that Jones was excluded from key elements of the Wayfarer PR strategy, but the missing Signal messages would have revealed the full picture, how and why she deliberately concealed her actions, coordinated strategies that directly contradicted Jones's directives, and aligned herself with Wayfarer's interests rather than those of Jones Works. These facts are central to evaluating whether Abel acted within the scope of her employment, which is the cornerstone of her indemnification claim. Once again, this is where déjà vu hits hard. This isn't just about spoliation, it's about the larger issue of indemnification. It's a plea, a signal to the judge. You better get this right. You better rule in my favor. The emphasis here is not subtle. It underscores just how critical these communications are. The Signal messages would also demonstrate that Abel consciously chose an ephemeral platform to coordinate work for Jones's own client behind her employer's back. This directly illuminates her state of mind, her intent to conceal her actions, and whether she was acting within or outside her employment. Abel's conduct here is a textbook example of bad faith. Her argument that Signal was chosen for security reasons to protect against hackers and aggressive media simply does not hold up. The auto-delete feature was unnecessary if security were the only concern. Abel knew she had a duty to preserve communications for anticipated litigation, making it far more plausible that she and her co-conspirators deliberately chose Signal precisely because it allowed their coordination to disappear without a trace. Given these facts, the court should impose sanctions under Rule 37E2, including an adverse inference and preclusion, as requested. For these reasons, Jones Works LLC respectfully asks the court to grant its motion for Rule 37E sanctions in its entirety. And yes, this whole situation is absurd. The constant filings, the arguments over ephemeral messages, the meticulous dissection of every PR decision, it's almost surreal. Even in the midst of other high-profile media spectacles, like Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, it's hard to imagine things being this chaotic. I mean, that case was wild, but this is another level. For those of you who have been along for the ride, I appreciate you sticking with it. And for a little holiday fun, you can get personalized videos from me at a discount on Cameo, just for a limited time. Check out my merch at buy.com and stay up to date on my website, me.com, for daily updates and entertainment. If you enjoy podcasts, our Patreon offers an exclusive weekly episode, plus the chance to chat with us daily on the message board. Sign up at patreon.com/mayam. If you watched until the very end, congratulations, you're in the 1%. Most people don't make it this far. Hit that like button, share this video, and drop a comment saying Stevie, because why not? We need more Stevie, less Blakey. Thoughts on all of this? We've covered a lot of ground. There were a few moments where the arguments made sense, but for the most part, full of nonsense. Let's discuss it all, say Stevie in the comments, and I'll see